Welcome to Magnificent Minds, where we explore the science of child development with both heart and reason, bringing clarity, compassion, and scientific evidence to questions that matter deeply to families. I want to tell you about a little girl. She's 7 and she loves cats. Ask her about cats and she can tell you exactly how fast a cheetah can go from standing still to 60 miles an hour, and why a snow leopard's tail is so long it can wrap it around itself like a blanket in the cold. She reads chapter books on her own. Her vocabulary astonishes adults. Her teachers describe her as a good student who is doing just fine. She sits in her seat. She follows directions. At lunch, she finds a spot at the end of the table and watches the other children. Not unfriendly, just observing, like she's taking notes on how they do it. She's been having stomach aches most mornings before school. Her pediatrician says she's healthy. The stomach aches keep coming. And here's what her parents have started to notice. She is a different child at school than she is at home. At school, she holds herself together. She watches the other girls, studies how they talk, what they do, and she works hard to do what they do. Then she walks in the front door and something releases. The backpack hits the floor and she falls apart. Sometimes it's tears over something small. Sometimes she just goes silent and curls up on the couch and needs an hour before she can speak in full sentences again. Her parents have brought this up. At every parent conference, they hear the same thing. She's such a good student. She's doing fine. But what they don't see at the school, and what very few professionals have been trained to look for in a 7-year-old girl, is that holding it together for so many hours at school costs something. That the noise of the cafeteria has been giving her headaches. She hasn't told anybody about those. That she has one friend she thinks about with an intensity that friend probably doesn't fully reciprocate. That books about cats aren't just a hobby, they're the part of the everyday when she feels completely like herself. Her parents know something is going on, but they don't have a name for it yet. Today, we're talking about one of the most important and under-recognized issues in autism. Why girls are so consistently missed, often for years, sometimes for decades. What autism actually looks like in girls compared to boys. And what changes when we finally see the full picture. What you'll learn today comes from the latest research, and it will change how you think about autism in boys and girls. For decades, most of the history of autism research, the story was autism is a condition that affects boys more than girls. The numbers seemed airtight. The ratio that got cited over and over was somewhere between 3 and 4 boys diagnosed for every 1 girl. And that number shaped which children got referred for evaluation. It shaped what clinicians were trained to look for. It shaped the face of autism in the public eye. A specific image, a young boy, often intensely focused on a very particular subject, who struggled visibly with social situations. But here's what was happening in the background. All of the earliest autism research, going way back to Lee O'Connor's foundational work in 1943, was really conducted almost entirely on male subjects. The behaviors that became the clinical definitions of autism were drawn from observations mainly of boys. The screening tools, the diagnostic checklists, the training materials, all of it built on a mainly male foundation. And so for generations, clinicians were essentially asking, does this child seem to have the qualities of an autistic boy? If the child in front of them was a girl, the answer was usually no. And she went home without answers. Now, a landmark study was just published in 2026 in the British Medical Journal, the largest study of its kind ever conducted, tracking nearly 2.7 million people in Sweden over 35 years. And what it found should change everything. While boys are still diagnosed more often during childhood, girls close the gap steadily through adolescence. And by age 20, the male to female ratio actually approaches 1-to-1, nearly equal. So if autism is occurring at roughly the same rate in girls and boys, and the data says it is, why are girls being missed during childhood, during the exact window when recognition and support would make the biggest difference? That is what I want to dig into today. And the answer is more fascinating and more important than I think most people realize. But first, I need to tell you what autism actually looks like in girls. Because I think most parents, most teachers, and honestly, a lot of clinicians have never had someone lay this out for them clearly. And once you hear it, you're going to see what you couldn't see before. So let me walk you through 4 key differences in what autism can look like in girls. First, social motivation. One of the things we associate most with autism is difficulty with social relationships. And when you see it in boys, it's often more visible. A boy on the autism spectrum might avoid group situations. They might seem genuinely uninterested in other children. They might prefer to be alone. And that's something a teacher or parent tends to notice. Girls are different. Research has consistently found that autistic girls show similar levels of social motivation to non-autistic girls. They want connection, deeply, often intensely. But wanting connection and being able to navigate it smoothly are 2 very different things. An autistic girl might have one devoted best friend and pour everything into that relationship. She might be studying social dynamics carefully from the outside, watching, learning the scripts, figuring out the rules. She might look like she's doing fine socially. She may even be doing fine by some external measures. But internally, she is working extraordinarily hard just to keep up. And here's something the research found about autistic girls' friendships that really caught my attention. Autistic girls are significantly more likely than autistic boys to be hurt by the more subtle, harder to see cruelties that can happen between girls. Things like being left out, finding that the group has quietly shifted against them, not knowing what they did wrong. The kind of thing that's very hard for an adult to see and very hard for a child to put into words. Autistic girls often struggle to identify what's happening when these dynamics emerge, or to know how to respond. So the girl who seems to have friends, she does, but it can be tiring, exhausting to keep up. And when that friendship shifts or ends, she may fall apart in a way that looks disproportionate to those around her. That reaction isn't drama. It's the loss of something she was working very, very hard to maintain. Second, special interests. Special interests are those subjects or areas of deep, passionate, often encyclopedic focus that are important to a person. And in autism, the depth and intensity of these interests are actually remarkably similar across genders. But what differs more often is the content. Autistic boys tend to gravitate toward interests that might stand out more. Maybe something like transit maps, street signs, trains, specific mechanical systems, numbers. These are often more easily noticed. A 5-year-old boy who can name every station on the London Underground gets our attention. Research studies find that autistic girls are more likely to develop intense interests in subjects that aren't as noticeably different, like, for example, animals, fictional characters, fantasy worlds, celebrities, human psychology, art, or nature. Interests that on the surface look like things we're used to seeing girls be interested in. The intensity is high. The level of interest, the deep, sometimes encyclopedic knowledge, the discomfort, distress when they can't engage with the interest, all of that is there, but it may not lead parents, family members, or professionals to pay as much attention. Or it may receive praise rather than the understanding that this is part of autism. Third, masking. Autistic girls and women engage in what researchers call masking or camouflaging at significantly higher rates than autistic boys and men. Multiple studies have confirmed this, and it's one of the most robust findings in this area. So, what is masking? Well, it is the effortful, learned performance of neurotypical behavior, watching how other people move through the world, how they make eye contact, how they laugh at the right moments, how they respond in different situations, and then practicing, rehearsing, scripting your own responses in advance so that in the moment you seem natural. That's not a small thing. That is an enormous amount of cognitive and emotional work happening below the surface. And here's what happens when someone does that work for years and years without recognition, without support, without understanding of what they're actually doing. They burn out. The autistic community calls it autistic burnout, and it is not ordinary tiredness. It is a system-level collapse with exhaustion and sometimes withdrawal from the world. Sometimes it gets called depression, anxiety, or chronic fatigue. And here's what the research shows specifically about masking and diagnosis. 3 out of 4 autistic women in one study reported that camouflaging had directly impacted their ability to receive a diagnosis. 3 out of 4, compared to only 1 out of 4 men. Fourth, you can think of as the misdiagnosis maze. Before autistic women receive an autism diagnosis, they typically receive several others first. Anxiety, depression, OCD, eating disorders, even borderline personality disorder or PTSD. I want to be cautious here. I'm not saying that these experiences and these diagnoses don't apply. In fact, for many autistic women, anxiety and depression, all of these can be a very real part of their lives, often arising from years of navigating a world that really wasn't designed for them. These aren't false diagnoses by any means, but they are frequently incomplete. When those conditions get treated in isolation without recognizing the underlying autistic neurology, the treatment misses the mark. You treat the anxiety, but you don't change the conditions that are generating it. You treat the depression, but you don't address the burnout that's underlying it and driving it. And the girl, the woman, well, she keeps working to understand why she never quite fits in, but doesn't have a complete answer. Why is it that she has to work so much harder than those around her? Why does everything feel like too much? And she often lands on the same explanation, which might be to blame herself. Now, this is one of the most heartbreaking parts of late diagnosis. When autistic women in midlife are finally identified, many describe a profound revisiting of their own childhood, their own history. A Scandinavian study of women diagnosed in middle age found that they rewrote then the narrative of their younger years once they had a diagnosis. Instead of this idea that there was something wrong with me, they could finally ask a completely different question. What kind of environment and support would have helped me thrive? That reframe, that single question, changes everything. So here's the honest answer to why this matters so much. The research is clear that missed or late diagnosis, especially for someone who has spent years masking, is associated with significantly higher rates of anxiety and depression, with burnout, with relationships that feel extremely difficult, with careers that may technically be successful by a lot of external measures, but can also be relentlessly exhausting. And it's associated with a quiet and persistent feeling of being just slightly out of step with everyone around you without ever knowing why. And it's associated with decades of self-blame for all of it. Now, here's the other side. When autistic girls are recognized, when they receive an accurate understanding of how their brain works, something shifts, not just practically, but fundamentally. They can stop asking, what is wrong with me? And start asking, what do I need? And the qualities that made autism hard to see in them, the social motivation, the often deep empathy, the passionate intensity of their interests, the careful observation of human behavior, those can be seen as the strengths they are. You can think of the mind of an autistic girl or woman as something like a supercomputer, rapidly processing enormous amounts of information, holding a broad range of interests with striking depth. That's not a description of a deficit. That's a description of a particular kind of brilliance. What the most recent research is telling us is that autism was never primarily a male condition. The numbers we've worked with for decades were always a partial picture taken with the wrong lens. And the more we widen that lens, the more people we see, the more girls we recognize, the more women diagnosed in their 40s and 50s who finally understand their own lives. I want to give you something concrete to take from today. If you have a daughter, if you have a student, if you have a client or patient, here are things worth paying attention to. Not to alarm you in any way, just to help you see more clearly. Do you know a girl who excels at school but comes completely apart at home? She's held it together all day, and home is where the mask comes off. Teachers say she's fine, but parents know something is wrong. Do you know a girl who has one intensely devoted friendship rather than a wide social group, who is genuinely devastated when that friendship shifts? Do you know a girl whose anxiety spikes in social situations, not because she doesn't want to be there, but because she's simultaneously managing her own experience and trying to figure out what everyone around her expects? Do you know a girl whose passion for a particular subject goes far deeper than her peers, who knows more about it than most adults do, who finds small talk nearly impossible but can talk for an hour about the thing she loves? Do you know a girl who uses fiction, books, shows, characters to understand social and emotional dynamics that she finds genuinely confusing in real life? Fiction is often a translation tool, a way of processing a world that doesn't always make intuitive sense. Trust your instincts, and please don't let "but she seems fine socially" be the end of the conversation. Keep in mind, too, that because a diagnostic evaluation depends a lot on what someone tells the evaluating clinician and is willing to show them, whether that's the child or the adult's self-report or a parent or a teacher, it can be harder to get to the truth. Masking can happen in an evaluation. So it takes a lot of trust, patience, and it may take time to get the right diagnosis and the right supports. But the earlier we recognize autistic qualities in girls, the more we can offer. The early years are a genuinely important window in terms of what becomes possible when a child has the right understanding and the right support. We're not talking about changing who she is. We're talking about building self-understanding, recognizing strengths, and building on all that tremendous potential towards long-lasting physical and mental health and well-being. Remember the 7-year-old I described at the start of this episode? Without recognition of autism and support, she becomes the teenager I see in my office so often. The one who's been diagnosed with anxiety, who is exhausted in ways she can't explain, who has spent years constructing a performance of normalcy and doesn't know that that's what she's been doing. The earlier we find her, the less of that road she has to walk alone. When autistic girls are recognized early, something extraordinary becomes possible. The intensity of her passions, the depth of her observations, the way she has been so carefully studying the world around her, all of it gets met with understanding instead of confusion. She doesn't need to become someone different. And that's what this research is really pointing us toward: a more complete picture, a wider lens, and a recognition that is long overdue for girls and women of all ages. If today's episode made you think of someone in your life, a daughter, a student, a niece, a sibling, an aunt, a mother, a friend, I hope you'll follow that instinct. The research is there, the clinical understanding is growing, and there is a whole community of autistic women who have written and spoken about their experiences so that no one else has to spend decades figuring it out alone. Thank you for being here today. If this helped you see something new, please share it, because the more people who hear this, the more girls that get recognized, the earlier, the better. I'll see you back here next time on Magnificent Minds.